All right, so this is the material that corresponds with the next film in the Crime and Media feature film presentation. Um, so we're going to talk a bit about the science of psychopathology, and then talk a little bit about serial killers and sort of the reality and the media version. So the starting point to talk about psychopathy is talk about personality. Psychopathy is a sort of a dimension of personality, a cluster of traits. So you talk about what a personality is. It's literally the collection of traits that somebody has, and traits tend to be stable over time and across situations. So if you think about impulsivity, right? Somebody who's impulsive tends to stay impulsive. They tend to be impulsive shoppers, impulsive drivers, and impulsive parents, and so on and so forth. So that said, you have traits. There's a whole body of literature on personality and crime, and so a lot of it is just simple sort of traits that everybody has. And the research question is, are there traits like impulsiveness that predict criminality? And the short answer is yes, but for us, the other sort of question to ask about personality and crime is whether there's this sort of distinct personal or criminal personality, right? There's sort of like this cluster of traits that loads up in people such that it makes them qualitatively different from other people. Are they different critters than us? And there you get into this realm of psychopathy. There is some controversy. I think we're on to the DSM-5. I need to update my slides. Well, the DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it's the sort of Bible for psychiatrists and psychologists in diagnosing disorders. And the DSM has never included psychopathy as a disorder. Instead, it has this antisocial personality disorder. If you look at the list of stuff on here and you ask, what chunk of these folks are in prison, or what chunk of prison inmates would qualify as APD, the answer is almost all of them. Studies have found 75 to 85% of prison inmates would meet the criteria to be diagnosed. So in terms of a criminologist looking at this, the criminologist basically says, well, yeah, you're defining kind of a chronic offender, not necessarily somebody who's different. In contrast, the idea of psychopathy is more narrow, and the idea has been around since the 1700s, and one of the interesting things is actually one of our oldest scientific constructs used to predict crime. I still like moral insanity. I think it perfectly captures what people are trying to communicate in psychopath, that they're literally sort of come across as normal except for their complete lack of conscience or morality. And in that sense, they're morally insane versus being just insane. Psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley's sort of given credit for putting together this picture of psychopathy and outlining all the characteristics. And the book, again, kind of captures the mask of sanity. It's this idea that these aren't people walking around with tinfoil on their heads talking about the monsters beaming stuff into their brain. These are folks who come across initially as normal, as sort of high energy, charismatic folks. So if you look at this, there's sort of two dimensions. One is the sort of emotional dimension. That's the superficial charm, lack of remorse, lack of emotional depth. And the other part is sort of behavioral, that these sorts of things go along with people who sort of bounce from sex partner to sex partner, from job to job. They tend to be impulsive and untruthful, pathological liars. So until relatively recently, this was a diagnosis that was kind of rarely used because it wasn't in the DSM, and the only way to get at it was sort of a clinical definition. Language-wise, most people who write on psychopathy now treat psychopaths and sociopaths as the same critter. That is, that the only difference would be one was caused by a really horrendous environment. You think of like horrible neglect and abuse of a child, and then there's, psychopath is used to describe people who don't have that, and the suggestion is that it's more biologically rooted. Most people now use psychopath regardless of what's caused, but there's some debate in the psych literature about whether that's wise or not. In terms of its overlap with serial killers, yeah, some serial killers are psychopaths, but some are not, and more importantly, the vast majority of psychopaths are not serial killers, um, though they may not be the most pleasant people in the world. The old way of diagnosing psychopathy was to have a psychiatrist make that diagnosis. What changed is in the 90s, a Canadian psychologist named Robert Hare developed the psychopathy checklist, PCL. And what he did is fairly ingenious. All he did is take most of these traits here, and he asked a series of canned questions. Ask the people about crimes they've committed, ask them about their behaviors. And all they're doing is taking this checklist and scoring each one of these. So you get a 2 if you definitely show signs of superficial charm, 1 if perhaps you do, but we're not sure, and 0 if you definitely don't. So the idea is, with 20 characteristics that are measured, a perfect psychopath would be a 40 because they would definitely have all these traits. So then most people who study these folks just draw a kind of arbitrary line somewhere that, if you're over 28, if you're over 30, we can be pretty damn sure that you are a psychopath. And so since the 90s, there's been some incredibly interesting research on psychopathy. One of the basic questions we still don't know, that is what percent of any society would qualify as psychopaths. Hare himself said something like 1%, but he's kind of ballparking. We don't know. What we do know is that if you go into prisons, only 10 to 25% of inmates score high enough to be psychopaths. So again, it's a much more sort of narrow construct than antisocial personality disorder. So people have kind of taken to studying differences between inmates in prison that are psychopaths and some that are not. And prisons make sense because it's given the nature of psychopaths, it's a good collection tank. But Hare and others have also started to focus on corporate executives. He has a book called Snakes in Suits. And it's an interesting question. Are there psychopaths out there that a good chunk of them that escaped prison that are sort of out in the wild yet? And the answer is we don't know. But here's some examples of ways people have sort of differences they found between inmates that are psychopaths and those that are not. One of the biggies for a long time was this idea that psychopaths do not benefit from treatment. And that came from this very persuasive study. These are, I think, if I remember right, disciples of Hare right here, graduate students maybe. And what they did is they sort of looked back on this treatment study that had been done. And from the records and other stuff, they diagnosed people that were involved in that as psychopaths or not. And what they found is that overall this treatment worked for non-psychopaths and it made psychopaths worse. So for a long time, that was kind of the Bible, like don't get psychopaths out of your treatment. They're not going to benefit. They're going to contaminate. They're going to make other people worse. Since the last 5 to 10 years, that's become a point of contention again, that there's been some criticism of how this study was done. So it's still sort of open for debate, but it's one of the ways that this construct has been used. A lot of people are looking at differences in emotion and speech. So I can give you one example. Hare and his colleagues, they audio taped interviews with psychopaths and interviews with non-psychopaths, all of whom were prison inmates. And then they had people blindly score any kind of logical inconsistencies, that language that sort of didn't make sense, wording that was like really weird or awkward. And so what they found is that the psychopaths had a lot more of these speech hiccups than non-psychopaths. And the idea is that their use of language is very superficial. They can't get sort of the meaning of what they're actually saying. And that relates to the other point in that people have studied how affect and emotion differ between psychopaths and non-psychopaths. That the one anecdote I remember from one of the Hare books, Robert Hare books I read, was he gives a description of an inmate who is a psychopath and a murderer, was asked a benign question, and instead of answering the question, went on this sort of rant about the murder, gruesome murder he had committed. And the description is like he was describing it like he was calling a baseball game, just a sort of dispassionate description of cutting up the body and doing all this other stuff. And the interviewer had been trained to sort of maintain a neutral face, but couldn't do it. Like in the middle of it, she sort of revealed her horror, and like in mid sentence, this guy stops and it goes, "Oh yeah, that's really horrible. I must have been insane when I did that." Um, it's like they get the idea of revulsion and they can read people's faces, but they don't actually sort of feel the revulsion themselves. Um, so a lot of the biological research on criminals now compares psychopaths to non-psychopaths. So part of the idea is that psychopaths are folks that don't get sort of over aroused. They maintain a low resting heart rate. Um, they're the people that like roller coasters as opposed to people that freak out in white knuckle roller coasters. Um, and obviously that can sort of relate to what they find exciting and what they don't find exciting. So part of it is maybe they're sort of sensation seeking folks, or at the least that angering other people or hurting other people doesn't sort of count as stimuli to them. That relates to the Seabrook article that's on the Moodle site. And so what he's trying to do is sort of understand the brain basis of behavior. And so he has these functional MRIs that's taking imaging of the brain, and the functional MRI allows you to take pictures while people are performing a task. And so he's looking at that language emotion connection. And so you give all these neutral statements that the inmates listen to, and then you slip in these kind of statements that hopefully for most people send off a bunch of like, what, like this is wrong. And so what he's finding is that the psychopaths tend not to react as much to statements that should be sort of emotionally charged. So his theory is that paralimbic region of the brain that controls emotion and inhibition is different or deficient in psychopaths. There still remains like a whole literature debate, sort of scientific throwdown about psychopathy. The last DSM manual, they had this big battle about should it be included or not, and ultimately it wasn't. But so one of the issues is whether they're actually sort of qualitatively different, right? If you think about the actual psychopathy checklist, it's a score from 0 to 40. Suggests that we all have a little bit of psychopathy in us that when it gets too severe, then it becomes folks that we call psychopath. In contrast, the people that see it as a psychopathy, not psychopathy thing basically say, look, these are folks who are very different from everybody else, that those traits load up in a way that makes them qualitatively different. This I already discussed, that one of the debates is how many are running around in the wilds without being arrested and imprisoned, and how many corporate executives would count as psychopaths. One of the issues in the literature is that this is a pretty loaded term. To call somebody a psychopath or to allude to somebody as a psychopath has very dire consequences for juries that are sentencing. It's been used in child custody cases that you hire a psychiatrist to come in and testify that your spouse is a psychopath, that she shouldn't have custody. And then there's media issues that the media has long misused this term psychopath and created a whole host of mythology that goes along with a psychopath. And in the media, psychopath is treated sort of synonymously with serial killer or murder. And as I said, in reality, the vast majority of psychopaths never kill anybody. Again, although they're probably pretty unpleasant people and do unpleasant things to other folks. All right. So that leads us into the kind of second topic, and that is, So one thing is to think about psychopaths and recognize there is a science literature and there's a reality, but it's different from how the media portrays it. The other issue is this idea of serial killers. And when I first started criminology, like every student I had wanted to study serial killers. It was what the CSI forensic stuff is now. Like all the students start out wanting to do that. That's what they see in the media. So in the 80s and early 90s, it was all about serial killers. And there was a sort of moral panic about that in the 80s that you had. And when we talked about satanic daycare and the other stuff, tied into that same genre was this panic over serial killers. And it was fueled by a variety of advocacy groups or moral entrepreneurs. That you had the Justice Department, religious groups, victim advocacy groups. The Justice Department made this claim that there was up to 4,000 victims a year. If you think about that, right? There's 15,000 homicides. 4,000 of them, if it was true that they were done by serial killers, holy cow, right? That would be a good chunk of the homicides that we had been sort of missing. Um, it turns out this was a statistic based on very stupid analysis of data. Basically, the idea was anytime we didn't know who the offender was, it could be a serial killer, therefore it was a serial killer. Um, so it was sort of linked in, tied to missing children. The idea was all these children are missing because they were abducted and killed by serial killers. Um, so this was sort of ginned up by the Justice Department, fueled by other folks. And there's a kernel of truth in the sense that you think about the 80s and the 90s, technology improved to a point where it was easier to detect people committing crimes or murders in different jurisdictions and to connect those dots. And so our detection got better. Um, People who have done analysis have also said there was a real increase in serial killer, but it was sort of rebound back to what had been the normal level for a while. The highlight was this Henry Lee Lucas. I think he was the Night Stalker, if I remember right. Anyhow, when he testified in front of Congress claiming that he had hundreds and hundreds of victims. Um, so that sort of fueled that fire as well. It turns out that Mr. Lucas was more of a serial confessor than he was an actual serial killer. That almost all the homicides he copped to turned out not to be him. What does the media do? Media capitalize on what works. Well, we talked about all semester, right? What does the media want? Newsworthiness, capture an audience if you're entertainment media. You want stranger, random violence. That's what scares the hell out of people. What better than this sort of strange, gruesome mass serial murderer that moves from place to place? Um, and so as early as 1984, HBO did a documentary called Murder Without Motive, and they had, I think it was an FBI profiler or some other self-proclaimed expert that said, you know, the analogy like, oh yeah, killing to them is like mowing the lawn to you. And so you have this, again, this sort of hyperbolic language. Out of that soup emerges this sort of serial killer genre in the entertainment media. You have serial killer books, which are still extraordinarily popular today, all the novels that you can read that involve serial killers. And the nature of serial killing changes in the media that this is great. And then Nicole Rafter book, she talks about the Boston Strangler, and at the end they had this dude shuffling in a mental hospital and this note that we're all supposed to think more carefully about how we treat these people. The responsibility is all of ours. And then you think about the transition, the short leap to Dirty Harry, which wasn't time-wise that much different, where the serial killer gets blown away into the gravel pit pond. Also, it's in that context that Thomas Harris writes the novels that become The Silence of the Lamb. And it's a sort of classic example of this new sort of sexually depraved, predatory psychopath that captures the entertainment media imagination. And it is, I hate to keep using this term, it is the Dirty Harry of serial killer films. It sort of changes from Silence of the Lambs, you have a whole host of serial killer movies, and that whole genre explodes on the scene. Um, and in this Silence of the Lambs, you get this, like, things we all know to be true about serial killers. They torture animals, they hunt within their own race and class, and so on and so forth. Um, and this mythology about the best way to apprehend serial killers. That is, you use profilers to track them down. Tied into all this is the FBI and this behavioral science unit. The behavioral science unit sort of branded itself as these sort of mind hunters. It's just sort of a sexy title with great self-promotion, but turns out not sort of scientific and not very empirically verified. But it was a good fit, right? With a small panic over these violent, sexually twisted killers. We'll track them down with these mine hunters. We'll profile them. And the language, this, starts to bleed into popular culture and media, right? Unsub as unknown subject, whether the crime scene is organized or disorganized, and so on and so forth. The FBI, that behavioral science unit, takes just a shot to the head in this Iowa incident. What happened is the turret on the USS Iowa exploded, and the Navy couldn't figure out what happened. They bring in this behavioral science unit, and the behavioral science unit sort of pins it on this one officer that they sort of make out as having, unfulfilled homosexual fantasies, and what happens is it all turns out to be entirely bullshit. That engineering groups later figure out that there was something mechanically wrong with the turret and exploded. And so 60 Minutes and other news organizations just skewer this behavioral science unit analysis, which was based on just conjecture and making connections that weren't actually there. And so in a sense, Silence of the Lambs is a way for them to kind of do a makeover and to get the public back on their side and to rebuild their public image. And they did. They consulted heavily for this film. And this Jack Crawford that's in the film is supposed to be a composite of profilers that helped with the film. So, what did we watch for in the movie? What I ask about the questions is, first to tie it to Psychopaths. And you can look at Hannibal Lecter, and see what traits he fits and what he doesn't. And so look at the list. I mean, even if you think he sort of fits most of them, what doesn't he fit? And then you have the other killer that Hannibal is supposed to help him track down, and whether he sort of meets the criteria for psychopath or not. So law enforcement, there's a lot of good stuff to watch. Again, this sort of magic ability to deduce things. What's the one? I always laugh at the part where the new detective, Agent Starling, is brought into this serial killer case, and immediately she's like an expert on autopsies, where she's going around talking about the fifth metatarsal, blah blah blah. Ask yourself what crim student could sort of walk in there and do that. This idea that Jack Crawford is the head mine hunter, able to manipulate serial killers and so on and so forth. There's a lot of stuff going on there. This other stuff is from the Raptor article that, aside from the serial killer stuff, you have a lot of sort of standard movie practices. You have the black sidekick. You have Clarice as a sort of stereotype of the female law enforcer. The mythology of the serial killers is this famous sort of scene when they're driving back from that autopsy in the car, and Jack Crawford turns around and says, tell me what you got. And she's spouting off all these serial killer sort of profile, right? So, for example, the serial killer is probably in his 30s. He's probably white. I can't remember exactly what it is. Probably because they hunt within their own race. And part of it is she's true. It's correct. But it's not just correct of serial killers, right? It's correct of all homicides and really almost every crime that people tend to victimize other people within their same race. And so to sort of portray it as something unique to serial killers is at the best sort of misleading. And you even get a dose in this movie of the from our correctional literature, this idea of smug hag corrections, the good doctor in the psychiatric hospital. Comes off as being a sort of smug jackass that fits very well with that smug hag image of correctional personnel. So, if you haven't seen the movie before, I hope you enjoyed it. Got some good feedback from the Dirty Harry movie. If you have seen it, it's worth a watch again to kind of see it from the lens of this sort of literature on psychopaths and on serial killers in general.